If we look at the artistic depictions of Jesus from the 3rd or the 4th centuries, we observe that Jesus was almost always depicted as Greek in appearance and having fair skin, and almost no beard and short hair. There's almost no consistency from one depiction to the next, and no halo around the head of Jesus. However, in the 6th century, we begin to see the introduction and standardization of a new style of painting Jesus, known as the Christ Pantocrator. The Bible's clear that the apostles, including Paul, Peter, James, and Barnabas, and others, went to Antioch, and that Antioch was a major center for early Christianity in the 1st century. And under the pending Roman destruction of Jerusalem, many Christians at the time fled to Antioch when they left Judea. By the 4th century, the Orthodox Christian sect had built for themselves a massive cathedral, and within its walls they housed many of their relics and treasures. One item of particular interest is described to us in the writings of Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, who lived in the mid-4th century. He tells us of a sacred Christ icon, which existed in Syria, where Antioch is, during his lifetime, that it was brought there by the disciples of Jesus in 68 AD, ahead of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. We can learn a little more about the Christ icon from a 6th century Byzantine monk who describes it as, quote, a very awesome icon bearing the likeness of Jesus. He says that it existed in Antioch and was highly venerated by Christians there. As early as the 4th and 5th centuries, we start to see some of the Pantocrator styles come into being. The halo begins to appear and the long hair and beard come into play. But many of the finer details of the face of Jesus are still not consistent or standardized in these early paintings. However, the first truly standardized instances of the Pantocrator, complete with facial details consistent with the others, are the Christ enthroned mosaic in the new Basilica of St. Apollinaris, completed on site in 526 AD, and the Basilica of St. Apollinaris in Classe, completed on site in 549 AD. This style portrayed Jesus with long hair, parted on the top of the head, a long beard, and a long nose. We also see the introduction of the halo and a surprising consistency in appearance from one to the next. In at least one of these Pantocrator images, the Holy Face icon, formerly installed in the Lateran Palace in the Vatican, explicitly declares itself to be a copy of the image of Edessa. So we have a good reason to believe that the introduction of the new style and standardization of the facial features are the result of artists copying from the image of Edessa as it became more prolific and public in the 6th century. In fact, since the Shroud of Constantinople would have been viewed through a circular opening in the slipcover while disguised as the image of Edessa, and since the halo did not appear on Jesus before the Pantocrator, it is more than reasonable to conclude that the only reason Christians started applying the halo to Jesus and eventually to the other, quote, saints, was because of the circular frame on the image of Edessa. We can draw further impact of the image of Edessa on Christian artwork through the analysis of the burial and entombment art. Early depictions of the entombment of Jesus showed his body wrapped up like a mummy. In these illuminated Syrian manuscripts, notice the Pantocrator head of Jesus, but the body is simply wrapped up and formless. But that changed around the 11th century, when burial artwork began to show Jesus' body laid out on a long piece of fabric. So we have these two traditions in Christian artwork. Sometime between the 10th and 12th century, Christians stopped using the formless mummy as Jesus' burial and started depicting Jesus laid out on a large piece of fabric. And sometime between the 5th and 7th century, Christians stopped portraying Jesus as an inconsistent and Greek and started adopting the Pantocrator style. And both of these critical points align perfectly with the public life of the image of Edessa and its transition from a facial image to a full-body shroud that God wore. So we have very good reason, based on historical artwork, to believe that Christians were referencing the image of Edessa and eventually the Shroud of Constantinople for their artwork, all the way back to the public appearance of the image of Edessa in the 6th century. Why should we think that the Christ icon, image of Edessa, and Shroud of Constantinople are in fact the exact same thing as the Shroud of Turin? First, let's consider the pollen evidence on the Shroud of Turin. Recall there are 58 species of pollen discovered on the shroud. And of those 58 species, there are 3 that do not grow in Europe and do not grow in Jerusalem. Do you remember where those 3 species grow? Urfa, which is ancient Edessa, and Constantinople. In fact, recall there are 55 species of pollen which grow in Jerusalem, 18 species which grow in Edessa, and 13 species which grow in Constantinople, the precise locations of the image of Edessa. So not only is it nearly impossible to explain the remote pollen on the shroud while holding to the medieval forgery hypothesis, it's also nearly impossible to separate the physical pollen evidence on the Shroud of Turin from the historical paper trail on the Shroud of Constantinople. So if we take the Shroud of Turin and we fold it in half between the dorsal and ventral images, we're left with just the ventral image. We take that, fold it in half again, and we're left with just the upper torso. Take that, fold it in half again, and we're left with a bust of Jesus centered on a wide, squatty piece of fabric. You take that, put a slipcover on it with a hole in the center, and the result is identical to the mural depiction of the image of Edessa from that church in Turkey. This is further supported by the fact that the Shroud of Turin has fold lines at 1/8 intervals. Now that's a lot of history, so let's do a quick recap. So the icon starts with the disciples in Jerusalem until it's taken to Antioch in 68 AD. It's kept on site and becomes known as this very awesome icon bearing the image of Christ. In 357 AD, the Arians take control of the Antioch Cathedral and all the relics within, including the Christ icon. Shortly after this date is when we start to see the first Christian paintings that bring in just some of the Pantocrator elements. In 362 AD, the Arian treasurer dies under torture, refusing to give up the relics in the possession of the Arians. Then in 380 AD, the Arians are evicted from Antioch, and they seek shelter in Ravenna with their fellow Arians. Here we see two of the earliest Pantocrator images completed on site, which contain all of the facial details that will eventually become the standard for paintings of Jesus. Sometime in the first half of the 6th century, before the Byzantines conquered the Ostrogoth kingdom in Ravenna, the Arians fled to Edessa, taking the image with them. Then, in 544 AD, we see the first public appearance of what will become the image of Edessa. Within the next 100 years, numerous Pantocrator images appear throughout all of Christendom, all with the halo present and all with the consistent facial features and appearance. The image remains in Edessa until 944 when it's brought to Constantinople. Sometime before 958 AD, someone in Constantinople removed the cover, unmounted it from the board, unfolded the shroud, and discovered it contained the entire body image of Jesus, becoming known as the Shroud that God wore. And within 100 years, the burial artwork of Jesus no longer depicted his body as formless and wrapped like a mummy, but rather laid out on a long piece of fabric. The Shroud of Constantinople was looted in 1204 when the city was sacked, disappearing for a time until it reappeared in Athens in 1205. So how do we connect these two cities? The answer lies in a man named Othon de la Ruche. He was a French crusader knight who took part in the sacking of Constantinople. After the Crusades, he was appointed Duke of Athens, which would explain how the shroud arrived in Athens. According to a papal bull, Othon retired in 1225 and returned to Burgundy, France with his family. And there, in a castle on his estate, still exists a chest with a plaque on it that says, the 13th century coffer in which was preserved at Ré Castle the Shroud of Christ brought by Othon de Ré from Constantinople. From here, Othon had a granddaughter named Isabella de la Ruche, and she married Henri de Vergy. They are the great-great-grandparents of Jeanne de Vergy, the wife of Geoffroy de Charnay. And with that, we've completed the chain of custody from the 1st century Christ icon all the way to the first widely accepted owner of the Shroud of Turin. Many skeptics will claim that the Shroud of Turin is simply another Pantocrator, that it was essentially copied from all of these other pieces of art. But that raises the question on a few of the facial features, like the lines in the neck. These lines don't serve any purpose. They don't refer to anything anatomical, and they're even awkwardly forced onto the image in some cases. It makes no sense why these marks would be included, unless, of course, these artists were copying from the Shroud of Turin, which does have this mark. likely due to a defect or a fold around the beard. But perhaps even more interesting is the open-top square between the eyebrows. Again, such a square is not natural and not anatomical. It's awkward and it's forced in these images. The more realistic ones try to soften the edges a little bit, despite still including it as a facial feature. Now, interestingly, the Shroud of Turin does have this feature, but there's more to it than meets the eye. When we look closely, we can see that there's actually a material defect in the shroud right down the middle of the face. A long rectangular strip, slightly darker than the rest of the material. And this extends from the top of the head all the way down through the chin. Therefore, the open top square between the eyebrows is actually attributed to this material defect in the Shroud of Turin, which makes it incredibly difficult to argue that it was copied from the other paintings. Instead, the most common sense interpretation of the evidence is that the material defect led the artists to see a slightly darker square region along the eyebrows and interpret that as a meaningful facial feature. So they included it despite its lack of anatomical correlation and its awkward presence among the facial features. We came to the conclusion that the shroud was the model for the other artwork, and not the other way around. One final point of interest. In every single medieval painting of Jesus' crucifixion, the nails are always in the center of the palm. Yet we know now, based on the physical structure of the bones in the hand, that a nail in that location would simply rip out through the fingers. It would not sufficiently carry the weight of the crucifixion victim. Interestingly, the shroud is different from every piece of medieval artwork in this detail, in that it places the nails at the wrist. Not only is this different, but it's also physiologically possible. That means that the shroud is more medically and physiologically accurate than every piece of medieval crucifixion artwork.